Hi friends. The month of October 2022, we posted every day on Shorts, a horror movie recommendation. We decided to put them together in one video, so if you're not into the shorts, or maybe you missed them, and we also added one at the end. Enjoy. Night of the Comet. A comet comes close to Earth, taking out most of the living, and turning the rest into mutant zombies. Sisters Regina and Samantha traverse LA trying to survive the cannibalistic monsters. Written and directed by Tom Eberhardt, starring Catherine Mary Stewart, Kelly Maroney, Robert Beltran, and Jeffrey Lewis. This sci-fi horror comedy is a gem of the 80s, with a feel of a 60s B-movie. Stewart and Maroney are both great here. This movie should be higher on more people's lists of great movies. The visuals are very 80s, and it feels low budget, but it's still a great watch. Funny, it's gory, and overall fun time. Piranha 3D. Spring break brings a slew of young college kids to Lake Victoria when an earthquake releases the titular piranha on the unexpected youths. Directed by Alexander Aja, written by Peter Goldfinger and Josh Stolberg, starring Elizabeth Shue, Terry O'Connell, Adam Scott, with cameos by Richard Dreyfuss, Christopher Lloyd, and Eli Roth. This is one of the few remakes that's actually kind of good. It's goofy and a little over the top sometimes, but it's fun and it's a great popcorn movie. The special effects are pretty good, and this one's a party watch. Invite a few friends over and have a great time. Vicious Fun. Hapless film critic Joel stumbles across a self-help group of serial killers. Directed by Cody Callahan and written by James Villeneuve. Starring Evan Marsh, Amber Goldfarb, Ari Mellon, and David Koechner. This comedic horror uses its 80s setting in an interesting way. Ari Mellon's over-the-top villain is probably the best thing about the film. It's got comedy moments that hit in almost all the right places. It's got laughs, gore. It's a perfect start for the night of horror movies. Horror Noir, a history of black horror. This documentary explores what the black community has brought to horror cinema through interviews with directors, actors, and writers. Directed by Xavier Bergen, based on a book by Robin R. Means Coleman, starring Rusty Cundiff, Ernest R. Dickerson, Paula Jai Parker, Rachel True, Keith David, Tony Todd, and Kelly Jo Minter, and more. Available on Shudder, this is a fascinating look at the history of black horror movies and how the black community were portrayed and eventually influenced and carved a piece out of the genre, like Blackula, Night of the Living Dead, Ganja and Haz, to more recent films like Attack the Block and Get Out. Not only is it an interesting and well-made look into black horror, it's a great list of movies you should check out. Scary stories to tell in the dark. Four youths find a mysterious book in an abandoned house, and it begins to bring the stories within to life, based on the anthology book series of the same name. Directed by Andre Overdahl, and last October, I recommended another one of his films, Autopsy of Jane Doe, and this is just as good. Written by Dan Hageman and Kevin Hageman, with screen story by Guillermo del Toro, starring Zoe Margaret Coletti, Michael Garza, Gabriel Rush, Austin Abrams, and Dean Norris. Somehow this is rated PG-13. It's probably the goriest PG-13 movie I've ever seen. It's fun and looks great. Overall, it has an eye for horror, and the visuals are crazy and fun. The cast is good, and the overall story is pretty neat. Even though it's rated PG-13, I would caution parents to make sure your kids can handle a movie like this. You're Next. Aubrey and Paul invite their children and their significant others for a weekend family reunion, when suddenly they are attacked by a masked group in this home invasion flick. Directed by Adam Wingard and written by Simon Barrett, who have worked together on The Guest and Blair Witch. Starring Sharni Vincent, Rob Moran, Barbara Crampton, AJ Bowen, and Ty West. It doesn't really bring anything new to the home invasion genre, but it's still a fun movie. It has funny moments, and the ending's pretty good. It's a great movie for a night of horror. Prince of Darkness. A professor and students investigate a strange cylinder filled with a green liquid that they inadvertently use to open the gate to hell. Written and directed by John Carpenter, and part of his Apocalypse trilogy, which includes The Thing and In the Mouth of Madness. Starring Donald Pleasance, Victor Wong, Dennis Dunn, Jameson Parker, and a cameo by Alice Cooper. This movie still kind of creeps me out. The visual effects are stunning, and Carpenter's score brings an eerie quality to the film. This is one I would follow up with a tamer film, as the visuals and subject matter may cause some to be uneasy. Drag Me to Hell. Bank loan officer Christine denies an old woman a renewal on her loan. Christine is cursed and fights for her soul. Directed by Sam Raimi, director of the classics Evil Dead, Darkman, and Spider-Man. written by Sam Raimi and Ivan Raimi, starring Alison Lohman, Justin Long, Lorna Raver, and David Paymer. This is pure Sam Raimi. The story's a little goofy, but it's all that you would expect from a Sam Raimi horror movie. The cast is great, and if you like any other Raimi's movies, you might like this. It's one of his more underrated films. I highly recommend it. Popcorn. A group of college students are organizing a horror movie marathon at their local theater. They find a horror short by a man who had killed his family for the final shot. The night takes a dark turn. Is the director back from the dead? Directed by Mark Harrier and written by Todd Hackett. Starring Jill Schoen, Tom Villard, Derek Rydall, and horror veterans Dee Wallace and Kelly Jo Minter. This is a wonderfully cheesy horror flick from 1991 and has the typical late 80s, early 90s horror, as well as the references to legendary director William Castle with their theater gags. It's real fun. It's a great balance of horror and comedy. Bad Taste. Aliens descend onto a small town and harvest humans for their fast food franchise. Derek and his teammates attempt to thwart the aliens' plans. Written and directed by Peter Jackson. Starring Peter Jackson, Terry Potter, Pete Hearn, Craig Smith, and Mike Minette. 4 years in the making. This first film by Lord of the Rings director is fun, gross, goofy, and it's low-budget horror at its best. The makeup effects, done by Jackson himself, is pretty good for the budget, as are the visual effects. Jackson plays two characters, one of the heroes and one of the villains. This is pretty enjoyable. If you're looking for a silly horror flick, I'd try to find this. Plus, you get to see Peter Jackson headbutt a seagull. It Stains the Sand Red. A Las Vegas exotic dancer becomes stranded in the desert with a zombie closely following her. Directed by Colin Minahan, written by Minahan and Stuart Ortiz, also known as the Vicious Brothers, starring Brittany Allen, Juan Riedinger, and Merwin Mondesir. This one's a little bit slower than other zombie flicks, but it stays interesting, and it brings something a little different with its limited cast. It feels fresh with the slow chase taking up most of the film, and the main character Molly having one-sided conversations with the ghoul that's following her. There's a little gore here and there. Brittany Allen does a pretty good job in the lead and carries much of the movie. Lights Out. Rebecca and her younger brother realize they both had supernatural experiences involving her estranged mother. As Rebecca tries to protect her brother, she begins seeing Diana, a spirit attached to the mother. Directed by David F. Sandberg and written by Eric Hesserer, based on Sandberg's original short of the same name. Starring Teresa Palmer, Gabriel Bateman, Maria Bello, and Alexander de Persia. The premise is interesting. It kind of reminds me of 2003's Darkness Falls, this silly little movie about the Tooth Fairy. They use light in that against the monster. There's some interesting visuals, and the use of different kinds of light sources to light the scenes is pretty cool, but it is a great effort for Sandberg's first feature. The Dead Zone. After a car accident, Johnny Smith awakens after a 5-year coma with psychic abilities. He learns things about people when he has physical contact with them. Directed by David Cronenberg, written by Jeffrey Boehm, based on the novel by Stephen King. Starring Christopher Walken, Brooke Adams, Tom Skerritt, and Martin Sheen. This is one of Cronenberg's more mainstream flicks. He's dealt with some similar themes in previous movies, but I think this is more accessible to a general audience. This is one of my favorite Walken dramatic roles, and it's one of Cronenberg's best in my opinion. The Gate. Glenn and his best friend Terry discover a gateway in Glenn's backyard under a recently fallen tree. An evil force is unleashed, and the boys must fight to survive and close the dreaded gate. Directed by Tibor Takacs, starring Stephen Dorff, Louis Tripp, and Krista Denton. This movie is a classic, uses great creature effects and forced perspective. It's a little creepy, and it was a regular rental when I was young. It's a typical 80s horror with a bit of goofiness. It uses a lot of in-camera tricks and great makeup effects. It's pretty fun. My Bloody Valentine. In a small mining town of Valentine's Bluff, the legend of Harry Warden, a miner who was once trapped and resorted to cannibalism. Many believe he is back, as a pickaxe-wielding masked killer begins preying on citizens on Valentine's Day. Directed by George Mihalka, written by John Beard, based on the concept by Stephen A. Miller. Starring Paul Kelman, Lori Hallier, Neil Affleck, Don Franks, and Cynthia Dale. This is one of those knockoff holiday slasher flicks from the 80s. The story happens on Saturday, February 14th. It's silly, cheesy, and trying to ride that popularity of early 80s slashers, but it's become a classic. The acting is a little over the top, but that's part of the fun. In many ways, I wish more modern horror movies were like this. Jacob's Ladder. Postal clerk Jacob starts experiencing odd occurrences. With help from his family and his friends, he hopes to understand his hallucinations and newly uncovered memories. Directed by Adrian Lyne, who previously directed Fatal Attraction and Flashdance, and written by Bruce Joel Rubin, who also wrote another hit that year, Ghost, starring Tim Robbins, Elizabeth Pena, and Danny Aiello. The film's not only a traditional horror movie, but it tackles subject matters that many of us will never know: PTSD, the loss of a child, and the after effects of the Vietnam War. I like to think it handles it with care. The cast is great, and we also see Eric LaSalle, Ving Rhames, Pruitt Taylor Vince, Jason Alexander. There's some crazy stuff that happens in this flick, and by the end, it'll probably stick with you. Salem's Lot. Ben Mears returns home to research an old mansion that overlooks the town, but he unexpectedly finds that evil has made it its home. Directed by Tobe Hooper, who directed horror classics Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. Written by Paul Monash, based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, starring David Soul, James Mason, Elisha Cook Jr., and Jeffrey Lewis. Not all the visuals look good compared to today. This was made for TV. It strays a little from the book, but it's still a great watch. It's one of my top 10 favorite vampire movies. There's an updated version made in 2004, which was also a TV movie, starring Rob Lowe in the lead. I liked both, but I prefer this one. Slumber Party Massacre. Trish and her friends decide to have a slumber party while her parents are away. They soon find out that an escaped murderer has set his sights on them while wielding a power drill. Directed by Amy Holden Jones, who went on to write Indecent Proposal, The Relic, and created the TV series The Resident on Hulu. Written by Rita Mae Brown, who originally wrote this as a parody of the slasher genre and had little involvement in the production. Starring Michelle Michaels, Robin Still, Deborah DeLisso, and Gina Smika Hunter. This movie is peak 80s, an overabundance of gore, gratuitous nudity, and a fun, cheesy story. It's not the best, and almost comical today, as far as the story and dialogue goes. It played on the terror in suburbia and how bad other slasher flicks were at the time. It retains some of the original idea of making the horror genre kind of silly, and there were 2 sequels, each ramping up the over-the-top action. Cat's Eye. The cat finds itself linked to 3 tales of terror, a company dedicated to get you to quit smoking, a love triangle between a gangster, his wife, and a tennis pro turns deadly, and a little girl who has terrible nightmares and who seeks the cat's protection. Directed by Lewis Teague, written by Stephen King, starring Drew Barrymore, James Woods, Alan King, Kenneth McMillan, Robert Hayes, James Naughton, and Candy Clark. In the first few minutes, there are references to other King stories, Cujo, Christine, and a few others. This is one of the first anthology films I'd seen. The connection using the cat I thought was a neat idea. The first 2 stories are based on Stephen King's short stories, Critters Inc. and The Ledge, both appearing in the Night Shift collection. The third is exclusive to the film. It's a little goofy in places, but each story has its own strength, playing off fears many of us probably can relate to. I highly recommend this. The Faculty. A high school is taken over by aliens who take over the bodies of the victims. A few of the students come together to fight back. Directed by Robert Rodriguez, writer and director of Desperado, Spy Kids, and Sin City. Written by Kevin Williamson, writer of Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. Starring Josh Hartnett, Jordana Brewster, Clea Duvall, Sean Hattasey, Laura Harris, Elijah Wood, Piper Laurie, Robert Patrick, Famke Jensen, Jon Stewart, Bebe Neuwirth, and Usher. This movie takes its cues from alien body snatching movies and placed it in 1990s high school. It's a little cheesy now. Back then it was amazing. It's still pretty fun after all these years. It's a bit of departure from other Rodriguez films as it's more mainstream, but it's a great watch. It has a killer soundtrack. The Changeling. After a horrifying accident that took the lives of his wife and daughter, music professor John Russell moves to Seattle and rents an old mansion. He finds that he may not be alone. Directed by Peter Medak, written by William Gray and Diane Maddox, starring George C. Scott, Trish Van Devere, and Melvin Douglas. This movie doesn't rely on gore, monsters, or crazy makeup effects. Medak was able to create an eerie atmosphere. At any moment, something could pop out. It has scares, but they are subtle for the most part, leaving you on edge waiting for the other shoe to drop. While it may be slow in some places, it's never not interesting. Scott is amazing here. As a grieving father and husband, now dealing with the supernatural. When strange things happen, the fear and confusion he has feels real. This is legit creepy. The sound, the direction, the lighting, editing, all contribute greatly to making this movie eerie to watch. The Final Girls. Max, the daughter of an 80s horror film scream queen, attends a screening of her mother's cult film, Camp Bloodbath, along with her friends. They end up being pulled into the movie and have to survive while being chased by the film's killer. Directed by Todd Strauss-Schulson, written by M.A. Fortin and Joshua John Miller, starring Taissa Farmiga, Adam Devine, Thomas Middleditch, Leah Shawkat, Alexander Ludwig, Nia Dobrev, and Malin Ackerman. This flick is great. It's campy, witty. There's so many things that could have gone wrong in the making of this film, but the filmmakers crafted a wonderfully told story with surprisingly a few layers to it. The cast is great. They each bring a little something to the movie. I can't recommend it enough. Wolf Cop. Alcoholic cop Lou Garou is out on call when he's knocked out in the woods. When he wakes mysteriously in his bed, he finds an occult semblance body, and he starts to feel strange. He soon finds that he's a werewolf and tries to balance his duties as a cop and his newfound life as a wolfman. Written and directed by Lowell Dean, starring Leo Fafard, Amy Matiso, Sarah Lind, Jonathan Cherry, and Jesse Moss. This is a very different take on the werewolf mythos. The story's kind of generic, but it's ramped up by the crazy premise. It cranks everything up to 10, and it's wild. Excuse the pun. This is not for everyone. It's a weird story, and some may find it excessive with the gore and the violence. It's one of the best, silliest, and sickest indie horror comedies that I think I've ever seen. The makeup effects aren't amazing, but it doesn't hurt the film. It's films like this that make me love indie horror. Lowell Dean definitely took what little the film had as far as budget goes and makes it work in his favor. Psycho Goreman. Brother and sister Luke and Mimi accidentally bring an evil alien monster to their suburban neighborhood, and with an ancient gem are able to command him in any way they see fit. Written and directed by Steve Kostansky, starring Matthew Nineber, Nita Jose Hanna, and Owen Murr. This movie's budget was only $1.5 million, but it's amazing. The creature effects are crazy. It makes a sci-fi horror comedy in a perfect way. The Psycho Goreman character is both hilarious and kind of creepy looking. It's a little over the top, but that's the great thing about it. It's reminiscent of Turbo Kid, another great movie, in a way that it tells a fast-paced story with crazy gore and buckets of blood, and the synthwave score is awesome. Cube. 7 strangers wake up in an odd structure made of rooms that contain deadly traps. They work their way through trying to figure out who put them there and why. Directed by Vincenzo Natali. Written by Natali, Graham Mason, and Andre Pajelic. Starring Nicole DeBoer, Maurice Dean Wint, David Hewitt, Andrew Miller, Nikki Gondani, and Wayne Robeson. This movie's a trip the first time through. After the first 5 minutes, I was hooked. It's a little slower, but the anxiety it brings kept me on edge. One of the best mystery horror flicks I've seen. While it was shot in basically one room, the changing of the lighting and the angles works well and makes the structure seem like it's never ending. The cast is great. There's a nice diversity with the characterizations, making it easy to root for them to get out. Woman in Black. A young widower, Arthur Kipps, is working as a solicitor and is tasked to go to a small town to go over paperwork of an old house that belonged to a woman who had recently died. What he finds is unexpected. Directed by James Watkins, written by Jane Goldman, based on the novel of the same name by Susan Hill, starring Daniel Radcliffe, Kieran Hines, Jessica Raine. Fresh off his role in the last Harry Potter, Radcliffe decided to do this quaint ghost story movie. The trailers do not do it justice. It's much creepier than it lets on. Radcliffe's great in the lead. He was able to show off his dramatic skills that he was honing in the Potter films and on the stage. The overall movie is creepy and a fun ghost story. Cursed. After a run-in with a creature in the dark, brother and sister Ellie and Jimmy soon find that they were attacked by a werewolf. Now they must find how to reverse it before they fully become man-eating beasts. Directed by Wes Craven and written by Kevin Williamson, starring Christina Ricci, Jesse Eisenberg, Judy Greer, and Joshua Jackson. Craven and Williamson team up again after Scream to tackle the werewolf genre. Williamson has a knack for horror and comedy that make this a fun ride. It did poorly critically and was plagued with production problems. It's still pretty fun in a goofy kind of way. Barbarian. Tess travels to Detroit for a job interview. Due to a mix-up with her Airbnb, she finds that Keith has the same reservation. He invites her to stay. The next day, she finds a secret room in the basement, and her trip takes a turn for the worse. Written and directed by Zach Kreger, starring Georgina Campbell, Bill Skarsgård, and Justin Long. It's slow at the start, getting to know the characters of Tess and Keith. Zach Kreger is mainly known for comedies like The Whitest Kids You Know and Miss March. Created a great eeriness to this flick. It went in directions I wasn't expecting. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything. The cast is great, Campbell and Skarsgård play well off each other, and Justin Long is at his best. The score is really cool. It's got kind of a synthy sound with the rhythms of a heartbeat, but it brings a nice creepy feel to the movie. It's smart and fun. Demons. In Berlin, a group of random strangers are given tickets to a film screening. During the show, members of the audience become demons and attack the rest of their fellow moviegoers. Directed by Lamberto Bava, written by Dario Argento, Lamberto Bava, Dardano Sacchetti, and Franco Ferrini. Starring Urbano Barberini, Natasha Hoving, Carl Zini, and Palazzo. This movie's crazy. Produced by horror legend Dario Argento, it's gross, creepy, and a fun movie. Compared to today, it's extremely campy. The cast is great. Bobby Rhodes stands out as Tony. They just don't make movies like this anymore. Henry, Portrait of Serial Killer. Henry, a serial killer, is on the move after being imprisoned for the murder of his mother. He comes to Chicago and stays with his friend from prison, Otis. The two begin a murderous relationship, culminating in The Trail of Blood. Directed by John McNaughton, written by Richard Fire and John McNaughton, starring Michael Rooker, Tom Towles, and Tracy Arnold. It's loosely based on Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. Michael Rooker is amazing in this. He feels methodical and every movement seems intentional. Even when he's being friendly, something seems a little off-kilter. Tom Towles doesn't get enough credit as the simple sadist Otis. For me, he's one of the most underrated actors out there. Night of the Demons. On Halloween night, a group of teens decide to throw a party at an old funeral home. An evil is unleashed on them, and it picks them off one by one. Directed by Kevin Tenney, written by Joe Augustine, starring Kathy Podewell, Lance Fenton, Amelia Kincaid, Linnea Quigley, Billy Gallo. This flick is wacky, but it's part of the reason I like it. It's campy, but the makeup effects are awesome. The acting and writing isn't the best, but it's still a fun movie. There's 2 sequels and a poorly made remake in 2009. If you're into long-form videos, check out our reviews. You can start with this one. Thanks for watching.